Hi everyone. I want to walk you through this document today and explain to you some of these theories and then tell you what you're going to be doing with them. So these are all people who are talking about this transition to adulthood, which is our current unit. Coder and Hall, there he is and there she is. I couldn't find a picture of her on her own, so that's her with her husband, which is not this guy. So I think it's John Coder and Elizabeth Hall. Anyhow, they have this idea of these four clocks that measure whether or not someone is an adult. So you'll see here, one of the questions about each theory is whether or not it is a stage theory. So a stage theory would, of course, be something that has stages. One follows the other. In this case, this is not a stage theory. It's not as if you finish the biological clock and then you go to the psychological clock. These are all operating on us all of the time. So in terms of adulthood, chronological clock would be whether or not you're old enough to be considered an adult, and that age would vary depending on what culture you're in. Even in Canada, there's all different ages that have to do with adulthood. At 16, you can drive. At 18, you can vote. At 19, you can drink, etc., etc. So for us, it's hard to pinpoint exactly at what age we're an adult. This isn't a very good measure of adulthood for Canadians these days. Biologically, are you tall? Are you adult sized? Have you reached sexual maturity, as in, can you have children? Now, this happens very early for Canadians, especially Canadian females these days. Does a 12-year-old girl who's able to produce children, is she an adult? Probably not. Psychologically, how is our brain working? Are we mature enough to make the decisions we need to make to be a grown-up? Sociologically, I want to talk a little bit about this sociological clock. This has to do with what other people are up to. And I can tell you that for me, I found this sociological clock to be very, very powerful. As someone who went through my 30s as a single person, I always would feel as if other people were lapping me. People who were getting married and having children, they were lapping me. They were getting ahead of me. Um, and that doesn't really go away, even if you get to those things later on in life. It's not as if you magically catch up. You're sort of always going to feel a bit behind. Um, so you never feel quite normal and as if you're quite on track with everyone else around you. Um, so it can be fairly powerful. Now, luckily these days, people are doing things at all different ages for a bunch of different reasons. It might have just been me that felt behind because I wasn't where I wanted to be, but some of that had to do with watching other people sort of pass me by for sure. So here are some examples then of this particular theory. And here are some exceptions. So this is really important that you understand this concept of people who violate the rules of these theories. So in this case, if someone is 40, they're unemployed, they're living at home, they're single, they don't have any children, but they don't care. They feel fine about it. They're happy, they're confident, they're out there, they're smiling. They don't seem to be stressed out or feel as if they're falling behind. Then they are not following the rules of this theory because according to the sociological clock, this person should feel bad about themselves. And if they don't, then they're an exception to the rule. Okay, so you need to be able to understand what would be an example of this theory and then what would be an exception to the rules of each one. So I've done the first one. Part of what you're going to do in this task is to fill in these two far right columns for all of the rest of them. And then I want to have a look at that and make sure that people are really clear about how these work before we do the unit test about these theories. Okay, so Jeffrey Arnett is a very modern day guy, and a couple of the links above, one's a TEDx talk and one is him on a Canadian talk show talking about his ideas. He is a stage theory. This theory of emerging adulthood is he's created a new stage between adolescence and adulthood, or he thinks he's discovered a new stage. Not everyone agrees with him, by the way. But these 5 features are not stages. These do not go in order. These are just 5 characteristics of people in this theory, in this stage that he would call it of emerging adulthood. So he says that this is an age of identity exploration. Young adults are trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out what they want. It's also an age of instability. Many people sort of in their early 20s are moving from place to place and not staying in one place for very long. It's an age of self-focus. Since you don't have that structure of living with your parents, at least not all of the time, and the structure of sort of that high school day in and day out grind is gone, people are trying to figure out, well, who do I want to be without all of that in place? Now that you get to choose, you have to make the choices, and that can be a little bit difficult and challenging. the age of feeling in between. So I'm taking responsibility for myself. There's lots of things I'm doing on my own, but I don't feel like an adult. I hear this all the time. I'm 44 years old and I feel this way sometimes. And I know other people who are in a similar place in their lives where they're married with small children and look around themselves every once in a while and think, what is going on here? I'm not a grown up. Who gave me this child to try and how am I supposed to keep them alive and on track? So it can be rather startling. So I don't know whether this ever really goes away, to be honest with you. Time will tell, I guess. It's also an age of possibilities. And I think this is fantastic that when Jeffrey Arnett talks to young people, not a whole lot older than yourselves, they feel very optimistic about their future, even though they may have been through some difficult challenges in their own upbringings with their own families. They feel like they're going to be okay, and that's fantastic. That really speaks to, I think, people's ability to see the positive. Okay, Jane Lovinger. She talks about the ego. And if you know anything about Freud, the ego and the superego, the ego is our sense of self. She has 10 stages. We're not going to get into all of those. For all of these theories, some of them go from birth to death, and we're just going to focus on the parts that concern us in terms of young adulthood. So she uses this phrase, autonomous self. So feeling confident in yourself, feeling good about yourself, feeling complete in yourself. People who are self-reliant and can see themselves as multifaceted and as unique and seeing, I think, even our faults. So being sort of, I call it being self-aware. That's part of being autonomous, I think. Lack of self-awareness is something that just drives me crazy. I'm sure I'm not the most self-aware person, but when I see it in others, it drives me a bit nuts. In any event, Jane identified the conformist stage for teenagers, that teenagers still can see the world in a fairly simple and stereotypical way. This helps them figure out right from wrong and try and sort of classify what people are doing and how they're feeling in a bit of a more simplistic and easier way to handle. A little bit later on, as some of you are probably starting to move through these stages, you'll come to what she calls the self-aware stage, where young adults start to comprehend that other people may be different than them, and maybe that's okay. So agreeing to disagree in a sense, and valuing almost the other side of an argument, which you look around us these days in the news and in politics, and you wouldn't think that's possible. But in our regular lives, we need to be able to do that. Start being able to understand the variations in feeling and opinion. So understanding that someone else may come to a certain place in their lives or a point of view for good reasons. Their experience may have been very different from yours, and it explains why they feel the way they do. The conscientious stage is where people are truly able to appreciate other people with all their amazing qualities and foibles and faults, and understand as well that in relationships there's got to be give and take. And we have to be able to be giving and make sure that we are putting out there what we want to get back. Jane worked for Erik Erikson, who we'll see later, and you'll see that he also thinks that identity is very important and that we have to have a solid identity within ourselves before we can form a high-functioning relationship with other people. Jane claims that very few adults ever reach full ego development. Okay, Leonard Perlin. This is one of my favorite ones, actually. He's not a stage theorist. These elements of psychological distress, or 4 elements that help us cope with psychological distress, are not, again, you don't have your individual characteristics, finish with those, and then have a range of skills. These are all with us all the time to one extent or another. Perlin says that we are in distress. We often have to cope with distress when things go wrong in our lives. And that distress will require some sort of a response in these elements. So these are the 4 elements that we use to deal with distress. So the first is our individual characteristics. These things we don't have a ton of control over. We have some, but not tons. Gender, race, intelligence, family background, personality, education, things about us as individuals. Our range of skills are the things that we have sort of in our pocket that we can pull out and play. We can sort of play these cards and help us get through things. So you may have great time management skills. Someone else might have the ability to always find the funny side of things and to see the lighter side of things. These are skills that we may have. Availability of social supports. Who is it in your life that you can tap on the shoulder and say, I need help? And it may be people you know really well. It may be knowing where to go in terms of getting professional help. Um, I can tell you that I've been through therapy a couple of times in my life because big things have gone wrong. And it's, yes, I lean on the people I that care about me the most, family and friends, but I also find having an outsider for some reason and sitting in office and talking about stuff can also be equally, if not more healthy or helpful rather. The nature and the timing of stress. This one I find really interesting. When does the stress happen? So losing your job is one thing when you're 22. It might be very different when you're 40, especially if you have other responsibilities on your plate. And the nature of the stress, right? Does the company shut down slowly over time, or do you walk to work one day, go to walk in the doors, and they've locked you out and the place is gone and done, and it's sudden? Um, so that can make things harder or easier to deal with. Here's Erik Erikson. He has, again, a full theory from birth till death, and he talks about psychosocial development. And he talks about dilemmas. Now, these are not, I repeat, not dilemmas such as what am I going to have for lunch today, or which job should I take, or who should I date. These are not dilemmas that we get to choose. These are the dilemmas. Identity versus role confusion. If you're talking about Erikson and you use the word dilemma, there's one, there's another one. Okay? So they're not dilemmas in the sort of regular sense of the word. So in adolescence into early adulthood, people are struggling with identity versus role confusion. Who am I and how do I figure that out and how do I narrow it down? So instead of trying to do 1,000 different things, figuring out what am I good at, what do I love, what do I do well, and what do I want to pursue can be very difficult for a lot of people. Intimacy versus isolation comes after that. So if you look at Erikson, there's always a positive on the left-hand side and the negative outcome on the right. So for him, it starts way back in infancy with trust versus mistrust. And the idea would be that if you start on the right-hand side, you may not come back to the left. So the idea is to try and always be functioning on the left-hand side of these dilemmas. Once you've solidified who you are, then Erikson would suggest it might be time to move on and find someone to share yourself with. He would argue that you really can't do that very well without having figured out who you are first. So people that are still struggling with role confusion, not sure what their goals are and who they are and where they're headed, are going to have trouble finding a partner. Roger Gould is a stage theorist, and he focuses in on the transitions from adolescence until midlife, and we're only going to focus on a couple of these here. His ideas have to do with inner stages of consciousness, and he believes that psychological development for adults has to do with dismantling these illusions of safety. So things are fairly simple, according to Roger Gould, for children. They just have to sort of listen to it, go along with their parents, and everything should be fine. And then all of a sudden, your teenagers sort of hit you like a wall for some of us. Teenagers develop self-confidence and form their own opinions, whereas children trust completely in their parents and believe that the parents will always protect and nurture them. Adolescents and young adults start to realize that they're kind of out there on their own, and we've got to figure out things for ourselves. Then in our mid to late 20s, we learn to rely on ourselves. And there are things in place in our society to help us do that, going away to school, all that kind of stuff, which is supposed to help us with that. And then later on, in the late 20s, early to mid 30s, we start to realize that life is complex and uncontrollable. And most people, once they hit 35 or 40, have some story to tell of something going wrong, and they'll be able to tell you that life is anything but simple. There are other stages that continue on, but we're not going to talk about those. Okay, I'm going to pause here and start a new one. So we'll start with Levinson in a minute because my maximum time is 15 minutes on this Screencast-O-Matic. All right.